Hi everyone, this is a tutorial on face proportions and how to use a really simple grid system in order to draw a human face. Here's my little business card here, so if you're looking to see more art and more tips, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram as @pixelprincess.art. And you can also find my work on Etsy under dog with a double G studio. Okay, so let's get started. So this is Procreate that I'm using in order to draw, and I've chosen this picture of my personal art hero, Frida Kahlo, in order to do the demo of the face proportions. So I'm just going to use an HB pencil. So the first thing you're going to want to do is just draw a nice big oval. And at this point, you don't really have to worry about what the actual face shape of the person is that you're drawing. I mean, you could start off trying to match the exact shape of the face, but you can also just start with a simple oval and then we'll adjust it later on. Okay, then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to draw a line down the middle of the oval vertically, and then we're also going to do another line right down the middle horizontally. Okay, and this is our eye line. And this type of technique, I should mention, it can work for a profile and a 3/4 pose, but you would change the lines a little bit. So I might do that in a different tutorial, but right now we're going to do a straight on view. So the subject is facing completely straight to the viewer, so she isn't turned from one side or the other. So you'll notice that eyes are exactly halfway down the head. Sometimes this doesn't include halfway down from the forehead, right? Because it depends on people's hairline and whether they have bangs and a whole bunch of different factors. But her head would actually be, somewhere up here, which would be the halfway point where the eyes are. So next what we're going to do is try to figure out how much space to leave between these eyes. So one really simple thing that you can kind of think of is that the eyes would generally fit in the head 3 times completely. So one eye here, one eye exactly fits in the middle, and then another eye. And then on the side of the head, you're going to get a half of an eye and a half of an eye. So in total, you're going to have at least the spacing for 4 eyes. So what I mean by that is when I'm kind of spacing things out, and if it helps when you're learning to actually measure with a ruler, you can do that as well if you can't kind of eyeball it. So what we're going to do is we're just going to measure out those spaces. So this is a half eye length, roughly. This is a full eye length, another full eye length, another full eye length, and I can adjust it a little bit here. I'll make that one a bit bigger, and then another half eye length here on the side. We can start with a really simple kind of lemon shape for the eyes. And again, that's something that we can go back to and adjust later on. So when I'm looking at her eyes, I would actually kind of clean this up a little bit and pay attention to the actual shape of the portrait I'm drawing. If you're drawing a generic person, go ahead and just kind of make that lemon shape if you're just learning. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use my eraser and just shape up these eyes a little bit. So when I look at the shape of her eye here, it's pretty straight in with this area, and then it kind of veers off onto an angle, so this part is going to be darker because those are her eyelashes. And then this is just a slight curve and a little bit more curved here. So now I want to look at the photo that I'm working from and fit in the iris and the pupil. So you have to remember, first of all, that your eyeball is actually rounded. So when we go to actually add the shading to this, we need to make sure that we're adding it so that everything does look like a round eyeball. So I'm going to go from this photo here and just kind of look at my spacing. Okay, how much white space is between the corner of the eye on this side and the iris, and then the corner of the eye on the other side and the iris. So there's more space here and then a little less space on the outside corner of the eye. And again, this is something you can kind of go back to and adjust your proportions to. I want to make it look nice and rounded, like that eye kind of continues underneath the parts that we can't see. And then I'm going to add in the little tear duct here. Okay, so that's added in. And then the next thing we want to do is think about the eyelids, the bottom eyelid as well as the top eyelid. So the top eyelid, again, it's going to depend on the pose of the person and the person that you're drawing specifically. But if you look at the Frida example here, again, we're just kind of looking at distances. Sorry, I'm going to make that pencil a little bit lighter. Again, we're going to look at the distance that's going on here. So I'm just going to roughly put in her eyelid like this. Zoom back out to see what that looks like. So I think I've more or less captured kind of the shape of her eye here. And then in the bottom, I'm going to use my eraser tool and I'm going to clean a lot of these lines up. So that we can make sure that we're adding in that bottom eyelid, which in this picture is actually really light. And it curves into the inside corner of the eye. So I'm actually going to take my eraser and pull out some of that area. And I mean, it's possible to draw your lines much more precisely than what I'm doing here, which is kind of a method where instead of drawing really continuous lines, you'll notice I'm using a lot of small wispy kind of lines, and that's just kind of a technique to use if you're, again, starting out and learning how to draw. It gives you a little bit more control. And I'm going to change the curve of this a little bit more. I want to make that more curved. The next thing we're going to do is kind of focus on where the pupil is. In this picture, so Frida's got brown eyes, and in the picture it's very shadowed, so it's hard to actually see where her pupil is. But the thing that really does stand out are the whites of the eyes, so the flecks in the eyes, and this really makes the eyes look like they're alive. So it's really important to add in those flecks of light, and I always tell my art students to even add them in even if the photo doesn't have them. So if you're working from a photo where there aren't, for whatever reason, the lighting, there aren't those flecks of lights in the eye, add them in anyway, because it's going to make a huge difference in making your portrait kind of come alive. So I'm just kind of around those flecks of light, penciling in the dark areas, and I'm just going to use a little bit of kind of a really rough hatching in order to put in the areas that are the darkest. And then if you want to, you can use, again, some hatching just to add a little bit of interest to the eye. If you had a really clear photo of the eye, you'd actually be able to see all of the little intricacies of it. So this one I'm going to end up coloring over it afterwards in a dark brown, so I'm not going to worry too much about all of the little flecks in the eye, in the iris. So again, pay attention to the roundness of the iris. So we're just going to round that off a little bit more. And then sometimes you'll notice eyes have a darker ring around them, so I kind of erased my outline just to clean up the edge, but I'm going to put a little bit of that ring back in there. And here it's in shadow, so I'm just going to add in some quick hatching in here that'll help me with my shading. And again, in here, there's a bit of shadow. So again, I'll add in some hatching. So to get back to that idea of roundness, my shading inside of the eye is going to be rounded. So I might have done some straight hatching before, but now when I'm getting to those corners of the eyes, especially this corner, which is really dark, I'm actually going to round that shading. So hopefully you guys can start to see that the eye is hopefully becoming just a little bit more three-dimensional. And we still have quite a bit of work to do on this. So this part is pretty dark. And what I'm doing as I'm drawing this, especially when you're working from a photograph, which most of us are on the Sketchy app, what you're going to do is constantly look back and forth between your photo and your drawing. If you start to become too fixated on the drawing, then, I mean, you might have the generic proportions of a person in the end, but it might not look like the source that you're drawing from. And sometimes that's okay too, because I actually like when things are a little bit more abstracted. Okay, I'm gonna darken my pencil a bit here, maybe change to a 6B pencil just to make it quicker. Just gonna really quickly block in the darks. So generally, the top of the eye, where the eyelashes are, can be darkened up. Oops. Again, I'm just making these adjustments as I'm looking at my photo. I'm noticing things that I want to change just to hopefully make it look more like my subject. Okay, so for now we're going to leave it there. So I've kind of put it side by side here. It's not exact, but I think we have the start of a pretty good looking eye that we can work with. So you would do the same thing, of course, and add your detail to your other eye. But what I want to talk about now is the rest of the proportions of the face. And then maybe I can do a follow-up video that kind of shows the process video of the whole drawing. So what we're going to do next, after you have your eye line, you're going to put in your nose line. And one really simple rule is to keep halving the face. So it's all about halves. So we've already halved it in both directions this way. Now we're going to continue to half it down the face with another horizontal line. So if we look at our source photo and you look at where the tip of the nose falls, and Frida's actually a really nice proportional face as an example, that tip of the nose is roughly the halfway point between the middle of the eye and the bottom of the chin. So again, if you're more comfortable with a ruler, you could take a ruler and actually, I'm going to go back to my HB pencil, and actually measure the distance. But you can also, if you have kind of good spatial awareness, you can just eyeball it. So this is roughly the same distance as maybe this. So I'll bring that down a little bit more. Sometimes when I'm looking a little bit farther back from it, that's another tip too. If you're not sure with your proportions, you can take a step back from your drawing and it allows you to see it with a little bit more clarity. So there we go, I like that better. So this is roughly half of this. And so the bottom of the nose needs to hit that line. So we'll kind of pay attention to Frida because that's who we're drawing here. She's got a little bit of a point to her nose. So I'm going to draw in that point right now, and I'm going to pay attention to where her nostrils begin. So if I were to draw a straight line from the edge of the nostril, what you'll notice is it actually connects to the corner of the eyeball. So I'm going to do it here. I'm going to put a straight line down, and that gives me a good spot to, right here, end the nostril and begin the corner of the nose. And then I can just look at, okay, what angle is that nostril on? Put in that angle, and then the nostril continues a little bit underneath. And if you look at this, it's kind of squared off in the photograph, so we're going to square it off. Now, this is assuming we would have finished our other eye first. It would be best to do that and make sure that your proportions are accurate with the space that's in between. But for the sake of the time, I'm just going to pretend like we finished that eye and do the exact same thing on this side. So I'm going to notice, and this isn't symmetrical. If I'm looking at her face, I can see a bit more of the nostril here than I can on the right-hand side. So I'm going to pay attention to those small details. I'm noticing that if I were to draw a straight line up, it would be a little bit inside the corner of the eye, so that's where the nostril is going to go. And again, I'm paying attention to the shape and the angle of all of these. And then you might need to adjust, see how far it comes up. And again, pay attention, right? What's the distance between the corner of the eye and the top of the nostril? Well, to me, my picture here, it looks like I actually have a little bit too much distance. So that might tell me that this nostril needs to come up a little bit more. And you can kind of play around with those proportions until everything is working out. So we have a good start here with the nose. One thing that people always ask is how to get it to look three-dimensional, because what we don't want to do, I'm just going to erase these guidelines now. Once you're done with the guidelines, you can go in and erase them as you go, so we don't need that line in the middle. Sometimes if you know my art already, you'll know that I leave my guidelines in oftentimes because I find it kind of interesting to show the process. It's something that I've kind of done over the last few years. So that's an option too. But I'm going to erase them for now so you can kind of see the shading a little bit better. One thing I also like to draw in is the ball of the nose. So I'm picturing like how big that ball of the nose would protrude out of the nose. So for her, it may be roughly this size. And I would just draw that in very lightly. And what that helps me to do is rough in where the shading is. So there's a little bit of shadow under here. This is in shadow, which makes sense, right? Because the ball of the nose is actually sticking out. It's what's closest to us as a viewer. I can see a little bit of shadow on the corners of the nostrils. So we're just going to really quickly just rough that in with some really quick hatching. And then what we're going to do too is if it helps you, you can draw really lightly the outline of the nose. So I'm paying attention to how her nose curves. So it goes in quite small in the middle and then it comes out wider at the nostrils. But we obviously don't want to just leave outlines for the most part unless we're drawing something that's more cartoon-like. So for a more realistic drawing, what we want to do instead is add shading to the sides of the nostrils. And you'll notice once you get into the corners of the eyes too, that shading gets pretty intense. So I'm just going to, again, really quickly rough that in, and we'll get to her eyebrows soon. I'm going to use a little bit of a cross-hatching technique here, just to kind of rough that in. And to make it even look more three-dimensional, if you want, you can bring a little bit of that shading into the middle of the nose. That's going to be a bit darker than the lightest part of the nose, which is usually that tip, that ball of the nose. Okay, so that gives us a good start. Again, I'm going to pay attention to, is the shape of the nose that I'm drawing similar to my subjects? If it's not, is there anything I can clean up? Well, maybe this line right here, I could make that a little bit more curved. I'm going to make that darker later on. Same with finishing the nostril under here. You get the idea. So there's things that we can adjust and add to it. Okay, so now we're going to use our grid again. So we're going to half it one more time. And then this time the rules change a little bit. So this is a little bit different than what we did with the eyes. So for example, we have a nose line here and we have a chin line here. What we're going to do is find the halfway mark. And again, you can use a ruler or just eyeball it. The halfway mark between the nose and the chin. And we're going to draw a line there. Now, the mouth is tricky for a few reasons. Because it depends whether the person has their mouth open and you can see teeth. Depends whether they're smiling or scowling or, you know, all these different poses that people could have, these different expressions. But this one's a pretty simple one because it's just a closed mouth. But what we really need to pay attention to is the distance between the tip of the nose that we've already drawn on the nose line here and the top of the lip. So one kind of common mistake that a lot of students do in my class when they're first learning to draw the face is they automatically think that this mouth line here is actually the center line of the mouth because it was in the case of the eyes. In the case of the mouth line, though, it actually should be roughly the bottom of the lip. So that means the bottom of the lip here, and sometimes it goes over a little bit, and that's fine, but it would be sitting on this mouth line. So I always in class draw a little smiley face like this, which looks hilarious when you're doing everything else fairly realistically, and then you have this funny little smile face. But what I've basically drawn in here is the underside of her bottom lip. And then again, we're going to use our rules where we kind of draw vertical lines down in order to match things up. So a general rule is if somebody is smiling, the outside of their mouth, the corner of their mouth, is actually going to line up to the middle of the eye. But since her mouth isn't open, she's not really smiling, her mouth is at rest, you'll notice that that line actually comes in a little bit further. So again, what you could do is you could grab a ruler or something straight. I'm going to use my little card here. And you could figure out, okay, the mouth ends here and it lines up to just inside the corner of the eye. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to again make another line that goes all the way down. And I can do that again on this side, making sure that that also lines up in the same location. And then we know just how big that smile is supposed to be. Because once we have that, the rest is really simple. So we can draw in her whole bottom lip here. It's going to look kind of funny at first. We'll fix those proportions later. The key, though, is to look again at that distance between the top lip, because if that doesn't become perfect, if we've been off a little bit with our measurements, we'll have to adjust that. So I'm going to kind of draw in, I'm not sure what this part, if anybody knows what this is, you can tell me, but this, I want to say cleft, but that's not even right, but this little area here that's under your nose above your lips. Sometimes it helps to draw that in, I find anyway, this little triangular shape, because then you can actually see just how far something might be. So I can already tell that I don't like where I've kind of placed the bottom of my mouth. So you've got a couple of options. If you're using traditional media, you just erase this. But because I'm using Procreate, I'll do something really quick to show you guys in case you don't know this already. Is you can take this little tool here, which is a selection tool, and you're going to be on freehand, and you're going to take this piece, which we've already drawn in, oops, and you're going to select the area that you want to move, and then take the arrow tool, and I'm just going to move it down a bit. So I'm going to look at how big that upper lip is and fit that in, okay? So even though I've drawn a lot of portraits, I make mistakes too, but the key is to notice them before it's too late. So we're going to draw in the shape of that lip. And again, I'm looking at my source image as carefully as possible to try to figure out what makes her lips look like her. I'm going to erase that middle line. I'm not very happy with it. This comes up a little bit, and then down again, and then up again a little bit. And then her bottom lip is a little bit larger, I think. So we'll kind of play around with that. So you can see that I actually did make a mistake with my proportions. I should have moved everything down for this particular face that I'm drawing. The rules would still apply, right? It's just that it didn't work out in this particular instance. So I'll draw it in and show you what I mean. So if this is the bottom of her lip, there's a little bit of shading under there. I'm just gonna finish where her chin is. Again, I'm looking at my photo. Okay, so hopefully those rules I just taught you still work out. Maybe I should have used my ruler after all. But what we have here is we have an eye line that's halfway between the top of the forehead and the chin. So halfway down. We have a nose line that is halfway down, hopefully, between the eye line and the chin again. And then we have a mouth line where the mouth rests on that bottom line that is halfway between the tip of the nose and the chin. And so everything is just cut in those halves. Before we move on to the ears, maybe I'll do a little bit of shading on the lips. Again, as a tip, I'm just going to change over to my 6B pencil. So you could add in, I like hatching, so I often do a little bit of hatching in the corner, but you want to make the lip look rounded. So one thing to remember is if you're doing any line work here is to make those lines round. And again, that's going to create a big difference in trying to make something look three-dimensional. So this little part of the lip too, it would be rounded. And then you could, of course, color that in and fill that in. And remembering too that the top lip is going to be darker than the bottom lip because our bottom lips protrude out of our face. So any part of any feature on your face that sticks out is going to be hit by light. So it's going to have a highlight on it. So I'm doing a really rough hatching job here just to show you. I'll just hatch that in at the bottom. And what I'm doing here is I'm leaving a highlight in the middle of the lips. And of course you could also shade the whole thing in and then use your eraser to pull out highlights as well. And I could have done that with the nose or with the eyes. So it's up to you kind of what technique you want to use. So what we're going to do next is, just for the sake of this drawing, I'm going to erase some of my grid lines here, the ones that are too heavy. If you're doing this on regular pencil and paper, you want to work really lightly because, as you all know, when you're trying to erase something on paper, it can leave lines if you're not careful. So you can use light lines. When you're doing it digitally, it doesn't really matter because you can erase it completely. So I'm going to erase all those grid lines to clean it up. It doesn't really look like Frida yet, but hopefully one day it will. And I'm just noticing a few things here, like I want to round off those lips a little bit more. So what we have to do now before doing the ears is we have to actually fix the facial proportions. So I was mentioning before that the face shape I always kind of work with last. I guess before that though, we should probably do the eyebrows because Frida's eyebrows are amazing. So I'm excited to do that. So with eyebrows, you're going to work them from the corners of your eyes. You're going to pay attention to what the distance is between the top of the eyelid. Uh-oh, it's frozen. Maybe my Apple Pencil died. Hold on, guys. Okay, so while that's charging, you want to pay attention to the distance between the top of the eyelid and the bottom of the eyebrow. So it's not a huge distance here. So I want to pay attention to it in that corner. And then with most people's eyebrows, they tend to be closer to the eye in the corners, the inside corners, and then get somewhat arched as they go to the outside corners. And you'll notice that the eyebrow goes past the outside corner. So let's see if this is going to work now, hopefully. Whoops. It would help if I was on black. Please tell me that wasn't my problem before. Okay, so I'm gonna look at the distance here. You could put in a little bit of a horizontal line if that helps you, especially with somebody with dark eyebrows, but if they've got light eyebrows, you probably don't want to do that. So her eyebrows, just gonna rough them in, are kind of arched. She obviously has the signature kind of unibrow that we're gonna add in a second. So just for the sake of this drawing, I'm gonna rough in an eyebrow shape. And then I'm gonna have a lot of fun doing vertical lines right by her eye. And her eyebrows actually stay pretty vertical. Most people's at this point would start going horizontal, but her amazing eyebrows are a little bit different. So paying attention to the direction that the hairs are going, and taking the time to do individual hairs is actually going to make a huge difference, I find, in your portraits. And then again, trying to make the shape of the eyebrow as accurate as possible. Depending on what kind of facial expression the person has, it's going to make a huge difference. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can see. I want to make them a little bit bigger. I want a few stray hairs up here. I want that to be bigger. And then I noticed in this, whoops, that's too big. But in this corner, maybe I went a little bit too wild. So I'm gonna make that a little bit better. Right, and then you can just go in with an eraser and shape them. So I'm just using an eraser right now. I actually love, I'll go back a little bit, but I love doing this with eyebrows, is after putting in the dominant color, going in with an eraser and pulling some of that color out where it's needed to add highlights. Her eyebrows are pretty dark, so we don't want to pull too much out. Okay. And I'll probably go back to those later on, but that gives us somewhat of an idea of the eyebrows. And then I mentioned before that for shading, this middle corner is going to be pretty darkly shaded. So that's something I'll want to add in later on too. And little things like creases under the eyes, shadows under the eyes there, shadows here. These are all things to pay attention to help make the portrait look like who you're drawing. Okay. We'll pretend that, again, that I finished the other side because I'm taking way too long. Now what we're going to do is focus on the face shape. So what we want to do is look at that distance of the temples to the eye. So I'm going to go back to a smaller pencil here. And I'm paying attention to all sorts of distances. Okay, so how far is this edge of this eyebrow to the temple? How far is the eye itself to the temple? The cheekbone kind of juts out a little bit here and then comes in. How far, again, is the nose maybe to the cheekbone, but also especially the mouth, because it might be even closer to the cheek. And then the jawline is a big deal too. So what is the shape of this jawline? Is it square? Is it rounded? Is it triangular? Again, you could clean up your chin here. Your chin might need to be bigger or smaller depending on how accurate you were with your proportions earlier on. We'll do that quickly for the other side. And then here's where things will really change up top, because her forehead is obviously not as wide as we have it, because that's showing the full extent of her head, which is hidden under her flowers and under her hair. So what you might want to do is like figure out the distance between the eyebrows and the forehead. And you could just kind of rough it in. And I don't like to use too much of an outline for that, because your hair isn't generally a perfect outline at the hairline. So I'm going to use a whole bunch of kind of wispy lines to get that as accurately as I can. So I'm looking at the distance between here and here, and I think it's pretty good, but you can always make it smaller in some areas. You're going to pay attention to her part that goes in that area. That's something I'll look for later on. Okay, and roughing that in. But again, looking at that distance and that distance. If things need to change a little bit, her face will end up looking a lot different actually when this blush is added in too. So this will all be shaded in to give her cheekbones. Even looking at this face right now, I know that I would want to go back and adjust that mouth a little bit. So I'm actually going to make it a little bit bigger. So these are all things that, again, going back and forth and paying attention to the distances between different objects. Okay, and then the ear line. So we can kind of see on this side here where our eye line was and where our nose line was right here. Generally speaking, the ear is going to go somewhat between those lines. But again, everybody's ears are different. So what you'll notice in the picture here is that the top of her ear actually does pretty much line up with the top of the eye here. Her hair, though, does come in this area. So I want to make sure that I've left enough room to add in the hair there. But the top of her ear is going to be here. And then we're going to look at, well, where does it come to? So it comes to roughly halfway between the nose and mouth, a little over halfway. So you'll notice too there's a shadow under her nose. If you want to, you can draw in the shadow because it basically lines up to the bottom of that shadow. And so the earlobe is here. And I'm just paying attention to distances again. Okay, how far is that from the face? What's the angle? Is that a little bit angled there? Okay, where this little line comes in, where does it line up? Well, again, it lines up to roughly the nostril of the nose. So I'm going to put it in there. And then it'll be a whole bunch of shading that's added into that ear in order to make it look more accurate. So it still needs a lot of work, and we'll have our earring that's added to it too. Even, you know, this kind of technique of measuring things in relation to each other, it works for accessories too. So the earring, how far does it come down? Well, this part of the earring comes down to midway through the bottom lip. You know, how long is that earring? Well, it doesn't even reach the bottom of the chin, so we need to make sure that, you know, it doesn't reach the bottom of the chin when we draw it in. So you can kind of pay attention to all of those things. And then the last thing I'll mention is the neck, looking again where it comes out of. Generally, it's going to come out of kind of the jawbone here. But again, look at your distances. So if I put the earring in this area, well, how far does that earring go over? And then what's the distance between it? So I can already see my neck should be moved over a little bit more. And my earring should be adjusted so that they're actually a small distance here and here. And you could do that for the other side as well. Okay, so it's looking a little bit like Frida. There's a few adjustments I still need to make. I don't love the lips yet. We'll kind of work on that. I need some work to the eyes, adding more shading to it. Obviously a lot more shading everywhere. Even the face shape, I know that her cheekbone comes out a little bit more in this top area, so I want to make sure that, that I adjust that later on and adjust her hairline and everything. But just to show you guys kind of the technique that I was talking about and how you might use a grid system in order to draw the face. So later on my Instagram, which is @pixelprincess.art, I will post the process video of this entire thing when it's finished. I probably won't end up leaving it as a close-up like this. I did that for the purposes of this video. I will probably end up adjusting it and doing a little bit more of her body and some interesting patterns in the background. So that's my plan, but I'm excited to work on this piece because I love Frida, and I think this is obviously a great photo to work from, which was her classic Vogue cover that she did. Okay, so hopefully I'll see you on my Instagram, and if you have any questions, you can just leave a comment there. Okay, thanks. Bye.